Some stories are better heard with someone else. But you're here alone. Welcome to Don't Listen Alone. This is 100% ad-free, just you and whatever comes next. Drop your location and the time before we begin. Now, listen carefully. Not everything you hear is part of the story. My fiancée and I had already been feeling for a while that something was wrong in the house we were living in. It was not just the kind of feeling people get when a home feels old or quiet or a little too still at night. This felt heavier than that. The energy in the house had become tense, uneasy, and at times almost openly negative. Most of it seemed to stay centered around the kitchen, which made the whole thing even stranger because a kitchen is supposed to be one of the most ordinary and comforting parts of a home. It is where people cook, eat, talk, and go through their daily routines. But in our house, that room had started to feel like the center of something we could not explain. At first, Michael and I could not even agree on what we were dealing with. We were not sure if there was one spirit in the house or two. We were not sure whether one presence was harmless and the other darker, or if it was only one angry spirit acting out in different ways. Some days it seemed almost harmless and strange, and other days it felt full of frustration and negativity. It was difficult to tell whether we were facing one presence with changing moods or more than one presence moving through the house at the same time. The uncertainty made everything harder because if you do not know what you are dealing with, it becomes almost impossible to know the right way to respond. For a while, we believed that at least one of the spirits, if not both, might be Michael's grandfather, who had passed away years earlier. That theory did not come out of nowhere. Some of the things happening in the house had a personal feeling to them, almost as if someone familiar with the home, or at least with domestic habits, was trying to continue old routines. But even with that idea in mind, the atmosphere in the house was getting harder to live with. Strange events kept happening, and the emotional weight of the place seemed to be getting worse instead of better. I had asked for advice from different people, and after hearing many opinions about what I should do, I decided to start taking action. Some of the things we tried helped for a while. Other things seemed to solve one problem only to wake up another. One of the first major incidents was the kitchen light. It had exploded, which was terrifying enough in itself, and because the house already felt spiritually unsettled, it was hard not to connect that event to whatever else had been going on. Still, I wanted to be reasonable. Before assuming something paranormal had caused it, we brought in an electrician to check the fixture and the wiring. I expected him to find some obvious explanation. Faulty wiring, old parts, frayed connections. Something practical that would at least make that one frightening incident make sense. But that is not what happened. He checked everything and found no reason at all for the light to have exploded. The wiring was not frayed. It was up to date. According to him, everything was perfect. That word stayed with me because it felt so unsettling in context. If everything was perfect, then why had the light burst the way it did? A problem with wiring would have been easy to accept. But being told that there was no visible reason only deepened the feeling that the house itself was involved in what had happened. After that, Michael and I decided we could not just sit around waiting for things to get worse. We had to do something. Because Michael wanted it, and because it felt like the right first step, I arranged to have a Christian blessing done on the house. I was hopeful, but I was also nervous. When people reach the point of blessing their home, it means they are no longer dealing with a vague, uneasy feeling. It means something has gone far enough that they need help claiming peace in their own space again. That was where we were. The blessing actually seemed to help, at least at first. The kitchen calmed down noticeably. Objects stopped disappearing. Coffee stopped somehow making itself. The negative atmosphere that had once felt so strong in that room seemed to lift. It was not dramatic in a movie-like way. It was quieter than that. But the difference was real. The room felt lighter, less hostile, less charged. For the first time in a while, we could go into the kitchen without immediately feeling that strange emotional pressure. I remember feeling relieved, as if maybe we had finally found the right answer. But only a few days later, the problem shifted. It was almost as if whatever had been active in the kitchen had simply moved elsewhere once that room no longer welcomed it. Michael and I noticed that the computer room had suddenly become the new center of the activity. And it did not happen subtly. The same kinds of strange events that had once focused on the kitchen now began happening there instead. Batteries disappeared overnight. The computer started turning itself on and off. And in the mornings, we would wake up to find papers and mail scattered all over the floor. That was especially disturbing because Michael and I were the only two people living in the house, and the dog slept in our room with us with the bedroom door closed. There was no normal explanation for waking up to find the computer room in disarray while everyone in the house had been asleep elsewhere. It felt deliberate. It felt as if the spirit, or spirits, were trying to let us know that blessing one room would not be enough to truly remove them. At that point, I decided to try something else. Since the Christian blessing had brought temporary relief, I thought perhaps bringing in someone from a different spiritual path might help in a deeper way, or at least from another angle. So I arranged for a professional pagan blessing to be done in the house. I was open to anything that might work. At that stage, I was less concerned about labels and more concerned about peace. I wanted whatever this was to leave us alone or move on properly. The result was similar to the first blessing. For a short time, things improved. The house settled down. The tension eased. The activity decreased. But again, the peace lasted only about a week. Then the same strange behavior returned. That repeated pattern was exhausting. It was almost worse than having nothing work at all, because each temporary success gave us hope before the house seemed to slip right back into the same cycle. It felt as though we were buying ourselves only a few days of calm at a time, and each return of the activity made the house feel more stubborn and more resistant. It was as if something there did not want to leave and was only reacting for a little while before beginning again. After that, Michael and I started trying to protect the house ourselves in every way we could think of. We decorated the house with crosses, stars, and other religious objects that had personal meaning to us. I started charging crystals and placing them in different parts of the house, hoping they might change the energy, or at least create some sense of protection. We put up symbols and meaningful items, whatever we thought might either banish the spirit or encourage it to move on peacefully. At that point we were no longer trying just one thing. We were trying many things at once, hoping something would finally hold. But the pattern stayed the same. A few days of peace. Then more problems. I also tried meditating and speaking directly to the spirit, asking it to leave. That did not work. Part of the problem was that I could never fully focus. Every time I tried, I would get this eerie sensation that made concentration almost impossible. It was the kind of feeling that tells you something is listening too closely, or standing just outside your range of vision, or moving around you while you are trying to be still. I could never settle into the calm state I needed. So even that attempt felt frustrated from the beginning. Eventually I decided we needed someone who could do more than bless the house. I wanted answers. I wanted clarity. I wanted to know whether we were dealing with one spirit or two, whether the presence was really Michael's grandfather, and what exactly it was trying to accomplish in our home. So I called a medium and asked her to come to the house. I remember the day she came because by then I was both hopeful and afraid. I wanted her to confirm something manageable, something we could understand and resolve. At the same time, I was afraid she would tell us there was something much worse there than we had guessed. By that point, our lives had become tangled up in trying to read moods in the house, interpret missing objects, respond to strange mechanical events, and guess at emotions we could not even see. I wanted the medium to tell us clearly what was going on. What she said stunned me. According to her, the spirit was indeed Michael's grandfather. She said he had chosen not to cross over yet because he was waiting for his wife. That one detail alone changed the whole emotional shape of the haunting. Suddenly, the strange domestic acts made more sense. She explained that he had been trying to carry on activities he used to do when he was alive. That was why coffee had been making itself. That was why things were being moved to places where he thought they belonged. He was, in a way, still trying to live in the house according to his own habits and logic. as if death had not broken his connection to those routines. What made it even harder to ignore was that she told us where some missing things had been hidden, including the batteries and the kitchen remote. That moved the whole experience from eerie theory into something much more concrete. It was not just vague talk about energy. She was describing actions and locations in ways that fit exactly with what we had been dealing with. But then she told us something even heavier. He was angry. Michael's grandmother, Gram Elsie, had suffered a stroke a few years earlier. Since then, according to the medium, the family had been fighting over who would control what assets, and who would eventually receive what from the will. They were fighting over money, over the house, over the car, over future inheritance, all while Gram was still alive. And the worst part of it was that while everyone was busy focusing on what they would get, no one was really taking care of her the way she needed. Since her stroke, she could not walk properly and could barely speak clearly, yet the people around her seemed more concerned with dividing her belongings than caring for her as a person. The medium said that Michael's grandfather felt the family had become self-indulgent and unconcerned with the well-being of their own. That line hit both of us hard because it was cruelly believable. We knew there had been family tension. We knew there were ugly, selfish dynamics around his grandmother's care and eventual inheritance. Hearing that his grandfather was angry about it suddenly made the chaos in the house feel less random and more personal. He was not just lingering out of attachment. He was projecting negative energy into the house because he was furious about what was happening to his wife. That explanation changed how we saw everything. It also made us feel terrible, because Michael and I were not the ones neglecting her. We actually did take care of Gram whenever she came to the house. We cared about her. We worried about her. We wanted things to be better for her. So it hurt to think that Michael's grandfather might be taking his anger out on us simply because we were the people living in the house he still connected to. The house had become his outlet for grief and rage, and we were the ones trapped inside that energy. I asked the medium to help him cross over. I asked her to explain to him that Michael and I did care for Gram, that we were not part of the selfishness, and that we wanted him to stop taking his anger out on us. She performed a blessing and spoke to Pap, asking him to cross over because it was his time. Michael and I also took his ashes, which had been kept in our house, and moved them to where Gram was living so that, in a symbolic sense, husband could be with wife. After that, the physical occurrences stopped. The disappearing objects stopped. The computer acting up stopped. The scattered papers stopped. The overt household antics were gone. By all visible signs, it seemed like the issue had finally been resolved. And yet, something still felt wrong. If I am being honest, Michael and I had both already had a faint feeling that something else in the house did not fully match the story of Pap. Even before the medium came, there were details that did not line up cleanly. There were older, stranger things. Things that did not feel like a grandfather making coffee or hiding remote controls. Things that felt darker, colder, and less personal. But once the physical disturbances ended, a new problem began. I started having terrible nightmares. Not occasional bad dreams. Not 1 or 2 rough nights. I mean vivid, frightening nightmares that came every time I went to sleep, to the point where I began dreading bedtime itself. They started only a few days after everything else had stopped. That timing bothered me immediately. It felt too direct to ignore. It was as if one kind of haunting had ended only for another kind to begin, not in the house around me, but inside my sleep. Most of the dreams revolved around being chased. There was always a knife. And even though the dreams were so intense that I would wake up sweating, sometimes clutching my throat, I could never remember all the details afterward. What stayed with me was the panic, the chasing, the knife, and the fear so strong that it followed me into waking. It was the sort of fear that leaves your body shaking even after your eyes are open and the room is real again. That alone would have been enough to worry me, but there was more. Michael had taken a week's vacation around that time, and instead of sleeping in our room with me, he spent most of it sleeping on the couch. He said the bedroom made him feel uncomfortable. I tried asking whether it was the temperature, too hot or too cold, but he said it was neither. He simply felt uncomfortable in that room. That answer made my fear grow because it meant I was not the only one sensing something had shifted. The room itself seemed wrong to him in a way he could not explain, just as the dreams felt wrong to me in a way I could not explain. Then more old questions started pushing their way back into my mind. When Michael was young, long before Pap died, he once saw his own reflection in the mirror brushing his teeth while he himself was not brushing them. That had happened when Pap was still alive. So how could that possibly have been explained by Pap lingering after death? There had also been shadows and mirrors over the years, and this disturbing evil-looking face that appeared ingrained into the back of our bathroom door. Those things had always lingered in the background of our thoughts. But now that the medium had so confidently framed everything around Pap, those older details stood out more than ever. Something just did not add up. That was the real problem. If the house disturbances had all been Pap, then what explained the older mirror incidents? What explained the shadows? What explained the face in the bathroom door? And now, what explained the nightmares? Why did the house become quieter while my sleep became unbearable? It felt less like a complete resolution and more like something had been hidden under another story, or perhaps something else had remained untouched while we were focused on Michael's grandfather. That possibility frightened me. I started wondering whether we had made a mistake in asking Pap to move on. Maybe he had not been the problem in the way we thought. Maybe he had been the more familiar, understandable presence in the house, while something else, something darker or stranger, had been there all along in the background. If that was true, then perhaps moving him on had only left the house more exposed to whatever else had been sharing the space. Of course, I also tried to be rational with myself. It was close to Halloween. Scary movies were everywhere on television. The season itself puts people in a more suggestive state of mind. I asked myself whether maybe the nightmares were only the result of stress, fear, suggestion, and too much exposure to spooky imagery. That would have been the easier explanation, and I wanted to believe it. I wanted to blame television, seasonal mood, and my own nerves instead of believing the problem had shifted into something more complicated and harder to see. But the truth was, the nightmares did not feel like ordinary bad dreams. They felt invasive. They felt repeated in a way that suggested a pattern, not randomness. And waking up with my hand at my throat made it harder to dismiss them as simple seasonal anxiety. The more I thought about it, the more one question kept returning to me: what kind of energy could hide from a medium? Or perhaps more accurately, what kind of energy could stay quiet while a medium focused on something else? Not once during her visit had she mentioned any second presence. She had spoken only of Pap. She had not sensed or acknowledged anything darker. And yet after Pap was asked to cross over, the house felt different in a way that did not bring full peace. It brought silence, yes, but also unease. The visible mischief ended, but the atmosphere did not feel fully healed. That is what makes these kinds of situations so difficult. If objects are moving and lights are exploding and coffee is making itself, at least the problem is out in the open. You can point to it. You can tell someone exactly what is happening. But when the house grows still and the fear moves into your dreams, the whole experience becomes harder to fight because it lives in a place no one else can witness as clearly. It leaves you wondering whether you are only exhausted and frightened, or whether something has truly turned its attention toward you in a more private way. I also could not shake the thought of Michael sleeping on the couch because of how the room felt to him. That mattered deeply to me. If it had only been my nightmares, then maybe I could have leaned more heavily on stress as the explanation. But his discomfort meant something in that room was bothering him too. And the fact that he could not explain it in any practical way only made it worse. It was not about heat or cold. It was not about noise. It was just a feeling, and feelings like that had been central to this whole haunting from the beginning. The more I looked back over everything, the more it seemed that the story of the house was layered. Maybe Pap had truly been there. Maybe he had truly been responsible for the domestic disturbances. Maybe his anger about Graham's neglect had really been affecting the energy in the house. I believe all of that could be true. But I also believe that something else may have been there too, something older or darker or simply different. Something that showed itself in mirrors, in lingering faces, in strange images on doors, in the oppressive feeling of certain rooms, and finally in dreams where fear came with a knife and the feeling of being hunted. That possibility sat heavier on me the longer I thought about it. I did not know what to do. Do we seek out another medium? Do we trust the blessings that worked only temporarily? Do we believe the nightmares are only stress, even when they feel like more? Do we call in religious help again, or would that only stir whatever remains? Do we leave the room alone? Sleep elsewhere? Ignore it and hope it fades? None of the choices felt clear. And underneath all of those questions was one deeper fear. What if whatever remains is the kind of thing that does not announce itself openly? What if it is subtle enough to hide behind another spirit's noise, and only begins showing itself once the louder presence is gone? That thought stayed with me especially at night. I would lie there thinking about Michael's childhood mirror incident. About the shadows. About the face on the bathroom door. About the medium speaking so confidently of Pap. About the fact that the activity stopped after his ashes were moved. About the fact that my nightmares began almost immediately after. About Michael abandoning the room to sleep on the couch because it simply felt wrong. It all seemed connected and disconnected at the same time, as if two stories had overlapped in the same house and we had only solved one of them. I think that is the hardest part of living with unexplained activity. It is not just fear. It is the unfinished logic of it all. You can survive fear. Fear rises and passes and rises again. But unanswered patterns stay with you because the mind is always trying to complete them. It wants to know which event belongs to which cause, which presence explains which feeling, and which step is the right one to take. When the answers never fully line up, you live in a state of constant half-understanding, and that can be just as draining as the hunting itself. At times I tried to comfort myself by focusing on what had improved. The house was not throwing mail across the floor anymore. The batteries were no longer disappearing. The kitchen was not acting like a battleground. Those were real improvements, and I did not want to ignore them. Whatever else might be true, something had changed for the better after the medium came and after Pap's ashes were moved. That had to matter. But peace that comes with a knife in your dreams does not feel like real peace. It feels conditional. It feels incomplete. And that is where I found myself left, uncertain whether we had truly solved the problem or only changed its shape. Some nights I wondered whether the nightmare energy was feeding on fear alone. If so, then perhaps paying too much attention to it would make it stronger, just as focusing too much on the house activity had sometimes seemed to make the atmosphere worse. Other nights I thought maybe it was not feeding on fear so much as trying to communicate through symbols too dark and violent for me to understand. A knife. Being chased. A hand at my throat when I woke. These are strong images, and strong images do not come into the mind repeatedly without leaving a mark. Then there was the bathroom door. That face, or whatever it was, engraved or seeming to appear in the back of it, had always bothered me. It did not feel like Pap. It did not feel domestic or grandfatherly or linked to grief over Graham. It felt stranger, uglier, less human in some way. Whenever I thought of it, I came back to the same feeling. The house held more than one emotional history. That face did not belong to a spirit trying to put things where they belong. It belonged to something that felt less understandable, less tied to love and family, and more tied to atmosphere itself. And if that is true, then it may explain why the medium did not mention it. Maybe she came in focused on contact with the active spirit creating the obvious disturbances and found exactly that. Maybe Pap was simply easier to read because he was actively interacting with the house in a familiar way. Perhaps whatever else remained was quieter, less direct, harder to classify, or not ready to show itself. Some energies may not seek communication. Some may only seek influence. That thought unsettled me more than the idea of Pap ever had. Because at least with Pap, there was a reason. A story. A grief. A motive. A person we knew. With something else, there was only the sense of wrongness. I wish I could say I immediately knew what to do next, but I did not. I stayed caught between explanations, between wanting to believe in the easier answer and feeling in my bones that the easier answer was not enough. Maybe Halloween movies and stress were part of it. Maybe the season added pressure to an already vulnerable mind. But I could not shake the conviction that the timing of the nightmares meant something. They began only after the house went quiet. That felt too pointed, too specific. The worst part was bedtime itself. Sleep should be a surrender into rest, but for me it became something closer to stepping toward an ambush. I began dreading the act of falling asleep because it no longer felt like peace. It felt like entering a place where I would be chased again, where the same panic would rise, where I would wake sweating and half choking and trying to remember what exactly had hunted me through my own dreams. That kind of fear changes the rhythm of daily life. It makes evening heavy. It makes darkness feel anticipatory. It makes you start bargaining with time, staying awake longer because you are afraid of what sleep will bring. Michael's discomfort in the room made it even harder to dismiss. If it had been only psychological, why did that room bother him too? Why did he prefer the couch during his vacation instead of resting in the bedroom? Why did the room itself feel like a place to avoid? That question still echoes in my mind. And so do the older ones. What made his reflection move on its own when he was young? What caused the shadows in the mirrors? What formed that face on the bathroom door? What energy lingers after the obvious haunting is resolved? Can a medium miss something because another spirit is louder? Can asking one spirit to cross over leave behind another one that was never properly addressed? And if the new symptoms live in sleep rather than the physical space of the house, how do you even begin to cleanse that? These were the questions I was left with after the dishes stopped moving and the papers stopped falling. And in a way, that is what frightened me most. Not the noise of the haunting, but the silence that followed it. Because silence should have brought relief. Instead, it brought dreams with knives, a room no one wanted to sleep in, and the sense that the true story of the house was not over yet.
That was the feeling I could not escape. Something just did not add up. Maybe we had helped Pap. Maybe we had done the right thing for him, for Graham, and for ourselves. But if that was true, then we had only closed one door in a house that seemed to contain more than one kind of darkness. And once that thought took hold, it was impossible to stop wondering what had been left behind, and whether it had now turned its full attention toward me.
A taxi driver that my parents know once had an experience so strange that people in the family still talk about it. I think he is related to us in some very distant way, though not closely enough that I know all the details about his life. What I do know is the story itself, because it was told more than once, always with the same serious tone people use when they are not trying to entertain anyone, but are repeating something that genuinely unsettled them. It was not told like a joke, and it was not told like one of those stories that grows bigger every time it is repeated. It was told simply, as something that happened to a tired man on a lonely road one night, and stayed with him long after. He had been working all day, driving people from one place to another, like taxi drivers do. It had been one of those long, draining days where every hour feels heavier than the last. By late night, he was exhausted. He had spent hours behind the wheel, carrying strangers, listening to directions, making small talk when needed, sitting through traffic, and pushing through the kind of deep tiredness that settles into the body when work has gone on too long. Anyone who has ever driven for hours knows how that feels. Your eyes are open, you are still doing what needs to be done, but your energy is almost gone. You move more by habit than by real alertness. Your body knows the road, the turns, the motions of driving, but your mind has become quieter and slower. That was the kind of state he was in when he started heading home. It was late, and by then he just wanted to get back to his house, get out of the car, and rest. He was not looking for anything unusual. He was not in the mood for conversation, adventure, or trouble. He was simply trying to finish the day. The road he turned onto was one that led toward his home, and because it was late, the area was mostly empty and quiet. There were not many people out at that hour. The kind of life and movement that fills streets during the day had mostly faded. It was the sort of road that feels lonely at night even if you know it well, the kind where headlights seem to cut through the darkness in a narrow path, and everything beyond them feels distant and still. As he drove, he noticed a girl standing by the side of the road. She looked as though she was waiting for someone. That was the first impression he had. She was not running, not waving wildly, not calling for help. She was simply there, standing alone, as if expecting a car to come for her. Even in his tired state, that stood out to him because it was strange to see a young woman alone so late at night on that road. She was dressed in a blue dress, and not just an ordinary dress either. According to the story, it was the kind of dress you might wear to a formal event, something elegant and special, the sort of dress that would fit at a high school prom or a party. It was not what you would expect to see on someone standing beside a dark road near a forested area in the middle of the night. He was tired and not paying as much attention as he should have been, but he still noticed enough to feel concerned. Whatever else may be said about him, he was not cold-hearted. He did not feel right about leaving a girl like that out there alone at such an hour, especially when she looked dressed for some event and had no visible car or companion with her. Even in his exhaustion, he still had enough kindness in him to stop. So he slowed the taxi and pulled up beside her. He rolled down the window and asked whether she needed a ride. The girl did not speak much. As the story was told to me, she simply nodded. There was nothing dramatic about it. No panic. No long explanation. She just accepted the ride and got into the passenger side of the car. That alone already gave the moment a strange feeling, at least when the story is told afterward. A girl in a formal blue dress, alone late at night on a road near a wooded area, stepping silently into a taxi as if she had expected it all along. But to him, in that moment, it was probably just one more quiet, odd thing in a long day of driving strangers. So he started driving again. As they went along, she gave him directions to her house. He listened and followed them. That part of the story has always felt eerie to me, because everything about it sounds so normal at first. A tired driver sees someone who needs help. He offers a ride. She gets in. She tells him where to go. It is all so ordinary on the surface that it makes what happened next feel even harder to accept. If the whole thing had been strange from the beginning, maybe the mind would have prepared itself. But that is not how it happened. It became frightening only later, after everything seemed normal enough to trust. The area where he lived was close to a forest-like place, or at least an area thick with trees and plant life. It was not an open, brightly lit road with houses pressed close together. It was one of those roads where the landscape feels darker and heavier at night because of the trees and the uneven land. At one point on the drive, he was passing a lower part of the forest area, the kind of place where the ground dropped away from the road. If you were standing down in that wooded part, you would have had to climb uphill to get back up to the road. It was not flat land. It was like a trench or dip in the land, with the road running above it. He was still driving, still following her directions, not expecting anything out of the ordinary. Then, suddenly, the passenger door flew open. Not eased open. Not slowly unlatched. It was thrown open. And before he could even fully react, the girl was out of the car. According to the story, she did not simply step out or fall close to the road. She seemed to be thrown, or to fly, out of the car and into the lower forest area beside the road. The image of it is violent even to imagine. A body leaving a moving vehicle, going down into a forest trench or low wooded section, vanishing into darkness and undergrowth. The whole thing happened so fast that the driver was not prepared for it at all. 1 second she was beside him in the car. The next, the door was open and she was gone. But what made it even stranger was what he did not hear. There should have been sound. If a person were thrown from a moving car into a low wooded area, you would expect to hear something. A body hitting the slope. Branches snapping. Leaves and dirt shifting. A thud. A cry. Something. But he heard none of that. No heavy landing. No crashing through brush. No human sound of pain or panic. Nothing that matched the violence of what had just happened. That silence was one of the most unnatural parts of the whole story. It was as if the action happened without the physical consequences that should have followed it. He stopped the car immediately. Of course he did. No one could witness something like that and keep driving. He jumped out and went searching for her. I always imagine his fear at that moment changing completely. Up until then, it had been a quiet late-night drive with a strange but manageable passenger. But once she went out of that car, everything would have changed. Suddenly he would have been full of panic, confusion, maybe guilt, and the urgent need to find her. A young woman had just left his moving vehicle in a terrible way. He must have expected to find her injured, unconscious, or worse. So he searched. He looked down into the low forest area. He searched through the trees and the plants. He must have called out, or at least listened for some sign of movement. He searched as long and as hard as he could. But no matter what he did, he could not find her. There was no body. No sound. No injured girl lying in the brush. Nothing. That is one of the details that makes the story feel impossible and yet unforgettable. People do not simply vanish after being thrown from a moving car into a wooded trench. If she had really been there, he should have found something. If she had fallen, there should have been a trail, some sign, some answer. But there was nothing. It was as if she had disappeared into the darkness itself. Eventually, he gave up. Not because he no longer cared, but because there was nothing more he could do in that moment. It was late. He was alone. He had searched and found nothing. So he got back in the car and went home. But he did not go home in peace. The questions must have been burning in him. Who was she? What happened? How could a person be thrown from a car and simply vanish without a trace? Why was there no sound? Why was there no body? Why had she been there in the first place? He did not let it go. The next morning, as soon as he could, he followed the directions the girl had given him the night before. That part matters to me too, because it shows he had not convinced himself it was all a dream or some tired mistake. He treated it like something real. He had been given directions, and he wanted answers. So he drove those directions in daylight, and arrived at a house. He went to the door and knocked. When someone answered, he asked whether a girl by that name lived there. I was never told her name, so I do not know what it was, only that he used it when he spoke to the people in that house. Then came the part that turned the whole story from strange to terrifying. The people at the house told him that the girl had died years before. Just like that. Not recently. Not the week before. Not as someone missing. Years before. He must have stood there staring, trying to understand what he was being told. After all, he had just spoken to her, picked her up, listened to her directions, watched her ride in his car, and seen her leave it. Yet the people standing in front of him were saying she was dead. So he asked how she had died. And the answer matched what had happened to him in a way that no normal explanation could smooth over. They told him that she had been at a party one night. When it was time to leave, she had gone with a friend because she did not have her own ride home. On the way back, while they were close to her house, the passenger side door flew open. Her friend had been driving drunk and too fast. The girl slipped or was thrown from the vehicle. She rolled off the road and into the deep forest trench beside it. A hard blow to the head from a large tree trunk caused her death several hours later. That was how she died. And that was what had happened in his taxi. The same side door. The same kind of violent opening. The same fall from the road into the lower wooded area. The same place. The same terrible moment repeated as if it had never ended. Once he heard that, everything from the previous night must have become clear in the worst possible way. The girl he picked up had not just looked lost or alone. She had been replaying her final journey. The direction she gave him had led home because that was where she had been trying to go when she died. The formal blue dress made sense too. She had likely been dressed up because she was coming back from some sort of event or party. Every little detail fit together once her story was told. And from then on, that was the explanation people gave. Her spirit reenacts her death with anyone kind enough to stop and offer her a ride. That idea has always haunted me more than the simple idea of a ghost. There is something deeply sad about a spirit not merely appearing, but repeating the same final moment again and again, trapped in that journey home that never quite ended. It suggests confusion, pain, or some unfinished motion of the soul that cannot move beyond the point of death. She does not seem to appear as a screaming ghost or some monstrous thing. She appears as a girl needing help. A girl dressed for a special night. A girl waiting by the roadside. A girl who accepts a ride. A girl trying to get home. And then the same terrible end comes again. What makes the story even more unsettling is that it depends on kindness. If the driver had been cruel or indifferent, if he had simply passed her by without caring, maybe nothing would have happened to him. But he stopped because he had a soft heart. He did what most decent people hoped they would do if they saw a young woman alone late at night on a lonely road. He offered help. And because of that kindness, he became part of her final pattern. That detail makes the story feel especially tragic. There is no punishment in it, not exactly. No sense that she is seeking revenge against the people who stop. It feels more like she can only continue her broken journey through the compassion of strangers. I have thought many times about what that taxi ride must have felt like in the moment, before he knew the truth. Did she speak softly? Did she sound sad? Was she calm? Did she look frightened at all? Or did she simply seem normal, almost detached, like someone who had made the same trip too many times to show emotion anymore? I was never told those details, and maybe he himself could not clearly remember them after what happened. But I wonder about them. I wonder whether she seemed fully alive, like an ordinary girl, or whether there was something about her presence that in daylight memory became harder to explain. Then there is the matter of the door. The passenger side door opening is the center of the whole story. It is the point where past and present collide. In the story of her real death, the door flew open because her drunk friend was driving too fast. In the taxi driver's encounter, the door flew open again. But this time there was no drunk teenage friend, no reckless party drive, just a tired man in a taxi on the road to his own home. Yet the door opened in exactly the same way, as if the event itself had more force than time. As if that moment had stamped itself so deeply into the place, and into her spirit that it could happen again under new circumstances. And then there is the silence after. I keep coming back to that because it is one of the details that makes the story feel so real, and so impossible at the same time. He expected noise. He expected impact. He expected the physical world to respond in its normal way. But the moment was missing that response. It is as though he saw the event, but not its earthly consequence. The girl vanished into the space where her death once happened, but there was no body to find because perhaps there had never truly been a body in his car at all. Only the memory of one strong enough to act like flesh for a little while. When I imagine him going to the house the next day, I always think about what it must have felt like to stand there and hear the family confirm the impossible. Maybe before he knocked, he still hoped there was a normal explanation. Maybe he expected to find a family with a confused daughter who had somehow survived and run off the night before. Maybe he was nervous about what he would say. But once they told him she had died several years ago, whatever hope remained for an ordinary answer must have disappeared. And then, hearing how she died, he would have had no room left for doubt. I think that is why the story stayed alive in the family. It was not one of those tales built only on one strange sighting and no follow-up. He did not just see a girl and later imagine the rest. He followed her directions. He found the house. He asked for her. He heard the story from the people who knew her. The event and the history matched too closely for the whole thing to be dismissed easily. That is probably why people still repeat it. Not because it sounds dramatic, but because it was too specific to ignore. There is also something eerie about the road itself. Road ghost stories are always unsettling because roads are supposed to connect people, to take them safely from one place to another. But when a road becomes attached to death, especially sudden death, it changes in the imagination. It stops being just a road and becomes a place where a life ended in motion. The idea that someone might still be trying to get home along that same stretch makes the road feel as though it holds memory in the asphalt, in the air, in the ditch beside it, in the trees below the slope. Every passing car then becomes part of a possibility. At any late hour, under the right conditions, someone might see her standing there again in that blue dress. And what then? Would everyone who stopped experience the same thing? Would she always get in quietly? Would she always give the same directions? Would she always leave the car at the same place in the same violent way? Or would it happen differently depending on the person? The story as I heard it suggests that she reenacts her death with anyone compassionate enough to help her, and that thought alone is chilling. It turns a simple act of mercy into an entrance into something tragic and supernatural. Yet there is sadness in it too, because if her spirit really does repeat that night, then she is not at peace. She is not resting. She is still on the road, still trying to get home, still not arriving. That is what makes the story more than just frightening. It is heartbreaking in its own way. A young woman dressed for a happy occasion, perhaps expecting nothing worse than a normal ride home, dies before she gets there. Then even in death, she keeps trying to finish that final trip. The blue dress matters to me too. That is such a vivid part of the story. It makes her feel human, specific, young. Not just some vague phantom by the road, but a girl who had somewhere to be earlier that night, a girl who got dressed up, maybe laughed with friends, maybe danced, maybe expected to go home and wake up the next day. The dress reminds you that she was alive, that she had an ordinary life until one terrible moment cut it short. Without that detail, the story would still be frightening. But with it, it becomes more sorrowful. I also think about the driver's exhaustion. If he had been more alert, would he have noticed something different about her? Would he have seen some clue that she was not fully alive? Or did his tiredness make him more open to the encounter? Sometimes people say that deep night, fatigue, and lonely roads create a kind of thinness between worlds. I do not know if that is true. But I do know he was tired enough not to question every detail right away, tired enough simply to offer help and keep driving. Maybe that made the encounter possible. Or maybe nothing about his condition mattered at all, and he was simply the person who happened to be passing by when she was there. What would I have done in his place? I ask myself that sometimes. If I were driving alone late at night and saw a girl in a fancy blue dress standing by the roadside, would I stop? I want to think I would, because leaving someone there feels cruel. But after hearing this story, there would always be that moment of hesitation now, that memory of what happened to him. That is one of the powers of a story like this. It changes the ordinary in your mind. A simple roadside encounter no longer feels entirely simple once you know something like this is said to happen. And maybe that is why these stories endure. Not because they are merely spooky, but because they attach themselves to common acts and familiar roads. They make the world feel slightly stranger than it looked the day before. They suggest that grief, sudden death, and unfinished journeys might not disappear as neatly as we like to think. That somewhere out there are still moments being replayed because they ended too hard, too fast, and too full of shock to settle into peace. I have never forgotten the part about him not hearing the thud. That is the detail that returns to me the most, perhaps because it is so quiet and so terrible at once. If he had heard a body hit the ground, the story would be frightening in one way. But the fact that there was nothing, that the violent fall happened without the sound that should have followed, gives the moment a hollow, supernatural quality. It is like watching reality go through the motions without fully becoming real. Enough realness for horror, but not enough for evidence. Enough presence to shock, but not enough to leave a body in the woods. And so he went home with unanswered questions, only to find the answer the next day waiting at the address she had given him. That image stays with me too. The ghost gave her real directions. She led him to a real house. She wanted to get home, even if only in the same broken ways she had tried before. That desire feels almost human beyond death. She was not leading him somewhere random. She was trying to finish something unfinished. That is why the story feels less like a haunting in the cruel sense, and more like a terrible repetition of loss. Still, it is frightening. A stranger in the car late at night is already a vulnerable situation. Add the quiet, the forest road, the fancy blue dress, the passenger door flying open, the impossible disappearance, and the next day confirmation that the girl has been dead for years, and the story becomes the kind that lingers. Not because of gore or some dramatic monster, but because it takes the familiar and lets the impossible slip into it so smoothly that you can imagine it happening. That is always the most effective kind of ghost story, the kind that feels only one small step away from the ordinary world. I imagine he must have driven differently after that. How could he not? Once you have had someone in your taxi who later turns out to have died years ago, every late-night road must feel different. Every lone figure at the edge of the headlights must make your heart beat harder. Every passenger side door must carry the memory of opening at the worst possible moment. I do not know whether he ever saw her again, or whether anyone else in the family ever claimed to have had the same ride. But even one encounter would be enough to change how a person drives home at night forever. And that, perhaps, is why the story still gets told. Because somewhere on that road, there is said to be a girl in a blue dress still trying to get home. Because a kind driver once stopped for her and watched her die again. Because the next morning he went where she told him to go and found out that he had not been carrying the living at all. Because her death had happened the same way, on the same side, in the same kind of fall, in the same forest trench. And because the idea that a spirit might keep reenacting its own end with anyone kind enough to help it is one of the saddest and most chilling things I have ever heard. So that is the story as I was told it. A tired taxi driver. A lonely road. A girl in a blue prom-like dress. A late-night act of mercy. A car door thrown open. A body that should have been found but never was. A house reached by following ghostly directions. A dead girl's name spoken at the door. A family explaining that she had died years earlier when a passenger side door flew open and she was thrown into the forest below. And the final thought that stays after all of it is this: sometimes the dead do not appear to frighten us on purpose. Sometimes they are only still trying to finish something that ended too suddenly. But that does not make meeting them on the road any less terrifying. I carefully read your full story and I did not skip any important event. I kept the original plot, all the major details, and the same overall meaning. I only rewrote it in easier English, made the flow smoother, and expanded it into a longer form so it feels more immersive and natural to read. A few years ago, when I was still living with my parents in our old house in Ohio, something happened to me that changed the way I looked at sleep, fear, and the things people call spiritual experiences. Back then, I had a few friends who were deeply interested in the spiritual world. They were the type of people who regularly visited so-called haunted houses and talked about energy, spirits, and things most people would laugh off or ignore. I was never really like that. I had never been especially spiritual, and I never truly believed in God in the traditional way. Most of that kind of stuff always seemed too far away from reality for me. It felt dramatic, exaggerated, or based more on hope and fear than anything real. But even though I did not fully believe, I always tried to keep an open mind. I was not the kind of person who would call someone crazy just because they believed in something I did not understand. One day, those friends came across a book that explained how to have an out-of-body experience. After only a couple of days, they came to me full of excitement, saying they had tried it, and that strange things had happened to them. They were eager, almost too eager, the way people get when they believe they have found proof of something bigger than ordinary life. They told me their stories in a serious way, and I listened carefully. Even if I did not believe them right away, part of me wanted to know whether what they were describing was actually possible. I wanted to find out for myself if it was all real or if it was just imagination, suggestion, or some kind of self-hypnosis. So one night, after hearing enough from them, I decided to try it on my own. I prepared for it exactly the way I had been told. I pulled the blankets off my bed and left only the white sheets. I took off the watch, necklaces, and rings that I usually wore to bed. I stripped down to just my boxers, climbed into bed, and turned off the light. I wanted the room to feel plain, still, and empty. I wanted nothing to distract me. Then I picked one single spot on the ceiling and stared at it, trying to stay completely focused. At first, it was harder than I expected. After only a few seconds, my mind kept drifting. I would start thinking about random things, then suddenly remember what I was trying to do and force my attention back to that one spot. It felt like a battle between my mind wanting to relax and fall asleep, and my will trying to keep it alert and pointed in one direction. Several times I almost gave up and felt like just rolling over and going to sleep. But I kept at it. I do not know exactly how long it took, but after around 10 minutes of fighting to keep my focus, something changed. I started hearing a sound. It was like static. A humming or buzzing noise, almost exactly like the white static sound a television makes when the cable goes out. It was not soft, and it was not part of the usual nighttime silence of the house. It had a sharp, electric feeling to it. The first thing that came into my mind was that I had forgotten to turn the TV off. But then I realized I had not left it on. The room was dark, quiet, and still, except for that sound. Once the static began, my body started to feel different too. I began to feel weightless, almost like the bed beneath me was no longer fully holding me. It felt like something was lifting me upward, gently pulling me off the mattress. At that moment, my fear disappeared and excitement took over. In my mind I was shouting, I did it. I actually did it. I felt this rush of pride and amazement, like everything I thought I knew about life, sleep, and reality had just been proven wrong in one instant. I had gone from doubt to excitement so fast that I barely had time to think. Then everything changed again. Out of the corner of my vision, I noticed something moving in. At first it was just shape and motion, but then it became clear enough to see. It was a face. A pale white face with black eyes and no mouth. It did not look like a normal human face. It looked almost like a mask, something smooth and unnatural. Around it were long white stream-like strands flowing back from it, almost like hair, except it moved more like it was floating underwater. On either side of the face were two hands, and they had the same flowing white strands trailing from them. The whole thing moved through the air in a graceful but unnatural way, and then it stopped directly above my face. It just hovered there, staring down into my eyes. It blocked my view of the spot on the ceiling I had been focusing on, and the second I really saw it, all the pride and excitement I had felt vanished. My heart dropped. My body went cold. And in that moment I remembered something one of my friends had said to me. He had warned me that if I was not careful, something else could enter my body during an out-of-body experience. I had not really believed him when he said it. But now, with this white thing hanging over me, that warning came back with full force. Then the figure suddenly jolted toward me, and I woke up in my bed, drenched in sweat. For a while after that, I convinced myself it had just been some weird dream. It had felt more real than any dream I had ever had, but I did not want to believe anything else. So I pushed it into the back of my mind and tried to forget it. Time passed. I got older. My life changed. I joined the military. I moved away from Ohio and started traveling all over the world. I visited different countries and saw what I used to think of as the opposite side of the world from the life I had known growing up. I was busy, focused, and surrounded by real-world responsibilities that made that old experience seem distant and unimportant. For a while, I really did forget about it, or at least I treated it as something strange from my past that did not mean much anymore. Then I got orders to deploy to Iraq. Once I got down into the desert and settled into life there, something in me changed again. I cannot explain why exactly. Maybe it was stress, maybe it was being far from home, maybe it was being surrounded by danger and the constant pressure of war. Whatever it was, something began happening to me at night. One night I had a terrifying experience that at first I thought was just a dream. I felt like my body weighed 100 pounds and I could not move. I could hear people walking into my room, but I was unable to turn my head and see who they were. The first feeling I had was not pure fear. It was more amazement mixed with confusion. I had never experienced anything like that before. I was aware, but I could not move. I could hear things, sense the room, but my body would not respond. Then I heard someone say something about killing me, and that was when the fear hit me hard. I forced myself to break out of it and wake up. The next day I started researching what had happened. I got on the internet and looked up the symptoms. That was when I learned about sleep paralysis. I cannot even explain how relieved I was when I found out that other people experienced this too. Suddenly there was a word for it, a medical or sleep-related idea that explained at least the basic part of what I had gone through. I read about different ways people handled it, and memorized the methods they said helped them wake up faster. For a little while, having a name for it made me feel safer. It gave me a way to file the experience under something explainable. But then it kept happening. Night after night, I had more episodes. And after enough of them, I began noticing something that chilled me all over again. The white figure I had seen years earlier in Ohio was still there. Every time I had sleep paralysis and was aware enough to look, I would see it hovering above my head. It never looked directly down at me. That is one thing that always stood out. Instead, it always faced the door. Its hands were raised, almost like it was ready to catch a basketball or brace against something. The posture was tense, ready. The more I noticed that, the more scared I became. Because now it was not just one isolated strange experience from my past. Whatever this thing was, it had followed me from my home in Ohio all the way to Iraq. That thought terrified me. Every night that I went into sleep paralysis and saw that white figure above me, I would do everything I could to wake up. I forced myself to try to move. Sometimes I would focus all my strength on rolling out of bed and hitting the ground just to shock myself back into waking. Every time I woke, I was panicked and shaken, but at least I was back in control of my body. Then in December of 2006, I was injured in Baghdad. I was airlifted out of Iraq and taken to a hospital in Germany for surgery and recovery. For a while, my attention shifted completely to physical pain, medical procedures, and healing. After a few weeks in the hospital, I was released and sent back to my unit's home base in Germany to wait for the rest of my unit to return from Iraq. You would think that getting out of the war zone might have changed something. You would think that if stress or environment were behind my experiences, maybe things would stop once I was away from Iraq. They did not. As soon as I got back to Germany, the sleep paralysis started again. And the same white figure was still there. No matter how I was lying in bed, it always hovered above me and faced the door without ever looking down at me. That detail became impossible to ignore. It was too consistent. Too specific. If it had only been a random dream figure, I would have expected it to change shape or behavior the way dream images do. But it never did. It always kept the same position, the same stance, the same focus on the doorway, as if it was watching for something. One night in Germany, I had been going through relationship problems and dealing with a lot of heavy things in my mind. I was emotionally drained. I had even started thinking about suicide. I do not say that lightly. I was in such a dark place mentally that, for one of the first times, I was no longer afraid to go to sleep even though I fully expected to have the same sleep paralysis again. I was too tired of everything to care. That night, when I opened my eyes during another episode, the white spirit was there again. But this time, instead of panicking right away, I decided I would just roll out of bed, wake myself up, and then go back to sleep because I was in no mood to deal with it. So I attempted to roll out. My feet touched the ground. My knees locked into place. My head balanced on my neck. My body still felt like it weighed 100 pounds, but for the first time ever during one of these episodes, I was standing. That shocked me more than anything else had. Every other time I had sleep paralysis, I had been trapped in bed under the white figure. But now I was on my feet. I realized without even turning around that the figure that had been above me was now behind me, probably staring at the back of my head from only a few inches away. And in that moment, I became sure that if it had not truly known I was there before, it knew now. Fear slammed back into me. The only thing I could think to do was get away from it. I focused every bit of my mind on taking a few steps toward the door. My body moved, but slowly, like I was walking through mud. Every step took enormous effort. Still, I was moving. I did not dare turn around to look behind me. I just kept trying to make it toward the door. Then, as I came around a corner near the doorway, I nearly ran into another figure. This one was completely black. Not gray, not cloudy, not pale. Black like a shadow. It stood in the shape of a man and looked much bigger than I was. It did not have the floating, graceful feeling of the white figure. It felt solid, dark, and threatening. The moment I saw it, my knees gave out. I fell against the wall, and then dropped to the floor. The instant I hit the floor, I woke up. The next day I spent hours replaying everything in my mind. I did not tell anyone. I felt like no one would believe me anyway, and maybe part of me was too shaken to even say it out loud. But as I kept turning the whole experience over in my head, I started thinking something I had never seriously considered before. Maybe I had been wrong about the white spirit. Up until then, I had been terrified of it. I had assumed it was the threat. It was the first thing I ever saw during that out-of-body attempt years earlier, and it had followed me across the world into my sleep paralysis. Naturally, I had been scared of it. But now I started realizing something important. It never looked down at me. It always faced the door. Its hands were raised as though it was ready to block, defend, or catch something. It never attacked me. It never came at me again the way it had that first night in Ohio. Maybe the one thing I had been so afraid of all these years had actually been the one thing protecting me while I slept. That thought changed everything. If that was true, then what about the black figures? What were they? Why did they always seem to stay outside the doorway or just beyond it? What were they waiting for? And what would happen if the white guardian above me ever left and did not come back? Those questions have stayed with me ever since. They run through my mind every day. Why has that white spirit chosen me? Why has it remained over me for so many years, from Ohio to Iraq to Germany? Is it a guardian? Is it tied to me somehow? Did I accidentally invite it into my life that night when I tried to force an out-of-body experience? And if it really is protecting me, then what exactly is it protecting me from? I cannot stop thinking about the first night in Ohio because it now seems different in my memory. At the time, when it rushed toward me, I thought it was attacking. But now I wonder if maybe it sensed something else, something I could not see, and came closer to me for another reason. Or maybe that first encounter was something else entirely, and only later did it become a protective presence. I do not know. I can only go by what I experienced, and how the pattern changed over time. The black figures are what truly frighten me now. The white one scares me less than it used to, even though it still unnerves me. But the black figures feel hostile. They feel like they are outside the edge of safety, waiting, watching, prowling near the door. And if I am right that the white figure is standing between them and me, then that means I may have been misunderstanding the entire situation for years. That possibility is hard to accept because it means I was terrified of my protector while something far worse stood in the dark just beyond it. I do not know if all of this is spiritual in nature, psychological, or some strange mix of both. I know sleep paralysis has been studied. I know people can hallucinate during it. I know stress, trauma, fear, and exhaustion can all shape what the mind sees during those moments between sleep and waking. Part of me wants very badly to believe that is all this is. A repeated dream state mixed with fear and memory. But another part of me cannot ignore how consistent the figures have been, how specific the details are, and how the pattern has stretched across different years, countries, and stages of my life. If it were just a random nightmare, why would the same white figure keep appearing in the same position every time? Why would it always face the door? Why would the black figure stay near the doorway? Why did it all begin the exact night I tried to push myself into an out-of-body experience? These questions have no easy answers. And that is why I eventually started looking for outside help. Not because I wanted attention or because I enjoy telling scary stories, but because I am exhausted by not knowing. I keep replaying these experiences, trying to make them fit into one explanation or another. Maybe it is all a dream that keeps relapsing. Maybe I damaged something in my own mind by scaring myself that first night. Maybe what I am dealing with is entirely within the world of sleep disorders and trauma. Or maybe there is something else involved, something spiritual, something that attached itself to me or chose me in some way. I honestly do not know. What I do know is that these experiences feel real when they happen. The fear is real. The weight in my body is real. The sensation of struggling to move is real. The figure above me is real enough in those moments that it has changed the way I sleep, the way I think, and the way I look at the dark corners of a room. And the black figures at the door feel even more real because now I think they may be the reason the white figure is there at all. Sometimes I wonder what would happen if I stopped fighting and turned around fully during one of these episodes. Would I finally see the white figure clearly from another angle? Would it react? Would the black figures come closer? Or would it all vanish the second I tried? I have never had the courage to find out. Fear takes over too quickly. Survival takes over. All I want in those moments is to wake up. I also think about how long this has lasted. Ohio. Then years later Iraq. Then Germany. Different beds, different rooms, different continents, same white figure. That kind of continuity is hard to explain away. If it had happened only in one house, I might blame the atmosphere. If it had happened only during war, I might blame stress and trauma. If it had happened only after the out-of-body attempt, I might blame suggestion or fear from that one event. But because it followed me through so many changes in life, none of those explanations feel complete on their own. At times, I try to comfort myself by believing the white figure is truly a guardian. That idea gives me some peace. If it has been with me all this time, maybe it has stayed because it has to. Maybe it chose me for some reason I do not understand. Maybe its presence has never been meant to frighten me, only to stand between me and something worse. If that is true, then I owe it more gratitude than fear. But even that thought brings more questions. Why me? Why did this begin only after I tried that exercise from the book? Did I open some door? Did I call attention to myself? Did I make myself vulnerable? Or was I already being watched by something long before that night, and that experience only made me aware of it? I wish I knew. Every day these questions keep passing through my head, and every day I still cannot come up with a clear solution. That is why I wanted to tell the story fully. I needed to put it out there in the hope that someone might read it and recognize something in it. Maybe someone else has seen a similar white figure.
Maybe someone else has had sleep paralysis with more than just random shadows. Maybe someone can explain why one figure would stay above someone for years and always face the door. Maybe someone can tell me whether I am dealing with a guardian, a spirit attached to me, a trauma-based dream pattern, or something else entirely. 'Cause right now, all I have are pieces. A strange experiment in Ohio. A white face with black eyes and no mouth. Years later, paralysis in Iraq. The same white figure over my head. Black shadow near the door. The same pattern again in Germany. One night standing up when I should have been frozen. The realization that the white one may not be my enemy after all. And the deeper fear that whatever waits outside that door may be the real threat. I do not know whether all of this is spiritual, psychological, or both. I do not know if I am haunted, protected, traumatized, or trapped in a repeated state between dreaming and waking. But I know it has been real enough to change my life. And I know that if there is any meaning in it, I have not found it yet. That is why I am still searching, still asking, still hoping someone somewhere has insight into what I am dealing with. Because whether it is a spirit, a guardian, or only a recurring dream that keeps relapsing, it has followed me too long for me to ignore it anymore.
I cannot live without my cell phone. It is always with me, always ringing, always carrying some strange news story straight into my ear. Sometimes the calls are from investigators, sometimes from frightened witnesses, sometimes from pranksters, and sometimes from people so terrified that their voices shake before they can even explain why they are calling. Over time, I have learned that my phone is more than just a way to stay in touch. It is almost like a doorway. Through it comes every strange case, every rumor, every investigation, every breathless voice wanting answers, every panic-filled plea for help, and every odd little twist that makes life in the paranormal world feel like one long conversation that never really ends. Last week was one of those times that reminded me exactly how bizarre that world can be. I got a call from one of my cousins. I am not going to say which one, because family is family. And even when they drive you crazy, you still have to see them again sooner or later. He called me up and asked if I had received a phone call from some mysterious person. At first I had no idea what he was talking about. I kept asking him to explain himself, but instead of answering me clearly, he started repeating bits and pieces of the conversation that this so-called mysterious caller had supposedly had with me. The moment he started saying those details, I knew exactly what he meant. A few days earlier I had gotten a call from a man who claimed he belonged to a group called LIT, which supposedly stood for Logistics Intelligence Task Force. He made it sound secretive, official, and important. According to him, the whole group was controlled by some unnamed VIP who did not want to be identified because of his position. The way he talked, you would think this mystery person was some political figure or powerful insider who absolutely could not afford to be linked publicly to the paranormal. The caller told me that LIT wanted to meet me at a private airport off Freeport Boulevard. From there, they were going to blindfold me, drive me to some hidden location, and let me investigate a home supposedly plagued by a demonic entity. Then, according to him, they wanted me to write the story. To be honest, I was excited. How could I not be? The whole thing sounded wild, secretive, dramatic, and exactly the kind of unbelievable assignment that would make a ghostwriter's heart race. I had already told Shannon McCabe, my dear Ms. McCabe herself, all about it. I was picturing black cars, hushed voices, some old house in the middle of nowhere, and a story too strange for anyone else to believe. It sounded absurd, but in this line of work, absurd does not automatically mean false. So yes, I was interested. Then my cousin let the truth out. It had all been a prank. He had set the whole thing up and had one of his buddies pretend to be the lead investigator of this fake LIT group. Very funny, cousin. Really hilarious. I laughed because what else can you do? But I also told myself that when I see him at the next family reunion, I will remember this little joke. He still has not confessed to being behind the OSIR call I once received before the Mount Shasta UFO and Bigfoot pre-investigation. But I have my suspicions about that too. He is exactly the type. But that is how things go with my phone. One minute it is a family prank, and the next minute it is a real paranormal investigation, a witness report, or some frantic voice on the edge of panic. That same Saturday, October 20th, 2007, my phone turned into a revolving door of the paranormal again, and before the day was over I had spoken with investigators, psychics, believers, skeptics, partygoers, and even a man who claimed he used to be a zombie. A lot of my calls that day were from HPI. Michelle Stump, one of the researchers with HPI, called me to talk about an upcoming scouting mission involving 2 cemeteries in Oakland. One of those cemeteries holds the grave of Elizabeth Short, better known to the world as the Black Dahlia. The other holds the graves of victims from the People's Temple Bijana mass suicide. Right away, the conversation took on that tone all paranormal people know well, the one that sits halfway between history and unease. Michelle wondered whether there might be residual haunting activity in either or both locations. And honestly, if there were ever places where emotion, tragedy, and history could leave some kind of imprint, those would certainly be among them. We both agreed that we would find out soon enough. Not long after Michelle, Holly DeLauder called. Holly was briefing me on another scouting mission, this one involving sightings of Bigfoot in Mendocino County, and the residual hauntings tied to the Round Valley Massacre. That is the thing about these calls. They move from one kind of strange to another so naturally that you can go from discussing famous murder victims to Bigfoot and massacres in the same conversation without even blinking. In my line of work, that feels normal. Then Chris Grissom called. He wanted to tell me about the Diamond Springs residential haunting investigation from the previous Friday. After Chris, Hanoko Zeidenberg called to say she was going to be late for Nancy Bradley's event, a night at the Enchanted Cottage. Hanoko and several HPI members had booked a seminar with Nancy Bradley, who is known as Psychic for the Stars, and after that seminar they were all going to investigate the Enchanted Cottage itself, which serves as the office of Nancy Bradley and the office of her husband, Robert Reppert of Gold Rush Ghosts. The reason for the investigation was simple. The Enchanted Cottage is supposed to be extremely haunted. I remember thinking that the newer members were in for an education, especially if they got the full haunted stairwell experience people kept talking about. I was already looking forward to hearing the reports from investigators who attended, people like Lisa Holt, Chris Grissom, Debbie Talani, and of course Nancy Bradley herself, who was one of the sweetest people you could meet. I knew sooner or later she would email me with her version of what happened that night. But while all that was going on, I was not at Nancy Bradley's house. I was heading somewhere completely different. Joey and Jean Palman were having a Hawaiian luau anniversary party, and I was going there instead. Of course, even when I tried to take a break from ghost hunting, the paranormal world seems to follow me anyway. Joey and Jean were there, naturally, but so were Lou Palman and Dee Pizarro, and all four of them were HPI paranormal investigators. That meant that even at a festive anniversary party, with music, food, dancers, and celebration all around us, there was still plenty of ghost talk in the air. The party itself was wonderful. There were hula dancers, a live band, DJ music, and a really festive atmosphere that made it feel like a proper celebration. It should have been the perfect chance to get away from paranormal talk for one evening. But that is not what happened. Instead, I had people coming up to me all night asking, "Are you the ghost hunter?" One man spoke to me for almost an hour about his own paranormal experiences while I was trying to enjoy the buffet of Filipino food that had been laid out for the guests. Everywhere I turned, it seemed someone wanted to ask about ghosts, hauntings, or strange things they had seen themselves. So even there, at a luau, I found myself repeating old stories again. I told the Marysville full-body apparition story. I told the Folsom Cemetery, being touched story. Over and over, I found myself explaining things, answering questions, and nodding seriously as people shared their own experiences. Then I would look up and see Jean Palman's daughter doing a Hawaiian fire dance, and suddenly my mind would drift to another fire dancer I had once seen on a rooftop in San Francisco during the Haunted Hate Tour. I remember saying to Shannon, "Only in San Francisco would you see something like that." It is funny how one strange memory always pulls another one up behind it. At some point during the party, I spotted my godson, Mark Edward Landon Cruz. He was just a little kid then, and there we were blowing bubbles with him, while his father Dirk and I laughed, and watched him laugh. It was one of those pure little moments that cut through all the ghost stories and strange talk and remind you that life is still ordinary, and warm in many ways. Those moments matter in this field because if all you ever focus on is darkness, mystery, and haunted places, you can forget how important simple joy is. Eventually I left the party and started heading home. But the night still was not done with me. On the way home, I got another call. This time it was from someone calling himself Dead Pete. Dead Pete claimed he was a real zombie. Or at least that he had once been one. Now, I have heard a lot of strange stories in my time, and I know how to listen without laughing even when what I am hearing sounds impossible. Still, this one was hard to take seriously. According to Pete, he had gone on vacation to Haiti and gotten involved with a Haitian girl. Her father, he said, was a voodoo shaman on the island. Then, when the girl saw him with another Haitian woman, he became marked. One night in a disco, he was stabbed in the arm with a hypodermic needle. He passed out, woke up in a coffin, and realized he had been buried alive. He claimed he was paralyzed but still aware of his surroundings. Then, according to his story, he was dug back up and used as a slave cutting sugarcane for 6 months before somehow breaking free of his state and escaping the island to return to California. He insisted that to this day he still had skin lesions on his arms, legs, and torso as proof of his zombie transformation. It was certainly a story. A great story, really. But I was not buying it. If he had sounded calmer, more grounded, less aggressive in the way he talked, I might have considered meeting him to hear the whole thing face to face. But something about him made me hesitate. So I listened, filed it away, and reminded myself once again that this is what my cell phone life is like. One moment I am dealing with a prank call from my cousin. The next I am discussing real investigations with HPI members. Then, somewhere between a luau and my driveway, I am listening to a man claim he used to be a zombie in Haiti. That is why, every so often, I need a break. That luau was one kind of break. Another came the previous week, when HPI held a Halloween costume party at the Sierra 2 Center. We all needed to remember that not every gathering has to involve dark hallways, EVP sessions, and people whispering about shadows. Sometimes you have to eat too many snacks, drink some good wine, and laugh with your fellow investigators while dressed like complete fools. I came dressed as the Grim Reaper. It seemed fitting. Around me, I saw witches, vampires, a Klingon, the Three Stooges, pirates, Renaissance ladies, and all sorts of other costumes. Tony and Jennifer Baca were dressed as vampires. Carol Gillis was too. Debbie Talani, Shannon McCabe, Athena Quinn, and Holly DeLauder all came dressed like Renaissance women. Tim Hawkins was in a kilt as a Scottish boy. Donna Reynolds came as a witch. R.V. Shade and Larry showed up as themselves, news reporters from the News and Review, which in its own way was probably a costume too. Robert Ruppert came as the Mad Hatter from Alice in Wonderland. Chris Grissom came dressed as a FedEx driver. Jenna DeLauder was Little Bo Peep. Joey and Jean Palman, Lou Palman, Dee Pizarro, Michelle Pakel, John Wachter, Bruce Farrington, Angel Kesty, and many others were all there too. It was good to see HPI in party mode for once. We danced. Shannon and I ballroom danced while Bruce DJ'd. Then I did what I was convinced at the time were killer disco moves to Disco Inferno by the Tramps and Thriller by Michael Jackson. Whether those moves were actually killer is a matter of opinion, but in my mind they certainly were. That night reminded me that HPI is not only about haunted places and serious investigations. There has to be room for play too. Still, even while taking breaks, my mind never drifts too far from the bigger strange questions that hang around everything. Around that time, the news had me thinking dark thoughts too. I had been watching CNN and listening closely to what was happening in the world. There were two things in particular that stood out to me, and they made me wonder whether the Mayan prediction about 2012 was beginning to unfold in some form after all. I kept thinking of two of the horsemen of the apocalypse, plague and war. Why? Because there was a so-called superbug, a staph infection turning into flesh-eating bacteria, spreading through high schools and even killing a 17-year-old boy. It sounded to me like the kind of thing people in another age would immediately call a sign of plague. Then there was Russia aligning itself with Iran and refusing to let America interfere with Iran's nuclear ambitions. That sounded like the edge of another kind of Cold War. I began thinking about the horsemen, about plague and war, and the whole thing got under my skin so deeply that I even had a vivid dream that we would be involved in nuclear strikes in 2008 or 2009. I hoped I was wrong. In fact, I still hoped it was just a dream brought on by too much news and too much thinking about Russia, Iran, and global conflict. But when a dream sticks with you that strongly, it is hard not to wonder. Still, enough gloom and doom. The living world has enough of that already. Let me get to the Fulton restaurant investigation. Fulton's Underground in Old Sacramento has one of those histories that feels ready-made for hauntings. The place itself already looks unusual. If you stand across the street from Fulton's West End Bar and Grill, it almost feels like part of a building is missing. But then you notice the opening in the wrought iron fence, and the old brick stairs leading down into a hidden courtyard. It is beautiful in its own way, but the beauty is wrapped in age, flood history, buried foundations, and old brickwork that seems to hold on to everything it has witnessed. Sacramento, of course, suffered repeated flooding in its early years, and eventually the whole city was raised by 12 feet. That meant the first floors of many old buildings effectively became basements, or were abandoned. Fulton's building predates that change, and the old retaining walls are still visible in the main dining area. The place has served different purposes over time, perhaps even functioning once as an assessor's office, or maybe a jail. Most of that labor and rebuilding in those days was done by Chinese immigrants who flooded into California during the gold rush. In a place like that, with so much layered history, hardship, and human presence, it is easy to understand why stories of haunting would attach themselves to the walls. The general manager, Brian Rodriguez, spends a lot of time there late at night after the customers and most of the staff go home. He openly admitted to me that he does not particularly like being in the building alone. According to him, you get a weird feeling there, like someone is watching you, checking you out, even if you do not actually see anything. He also admitted to glimpsing shadows from time to time, though he still tries to tell himself those things must be explainable. The stories from staff were even more interesting. One bartender, April Williams, said that on some mornings chairs inside the restaurant would be turned backwards when no one should have touched them. People had felt cold spots, had their skirts tugged by invisible hands, and even quit because they were so unnerved. One waitress once saw the apparition of an Asian man with a ponytail in the banquet room. Psychics who visited the building pointed out specific spots where they believed people had died. The so-called mafia room, a private space with a long table and wood-paneled walls, gave off such a negative feeling that some psychics refused to enter it. Even Brian had been joking about the haunting once when a large potted fern across the room suddenly crashed over, sending everyone running. When Debbie Tawney and I visited Fulton's Underground at 900 2nd Street, she introduced me to Brian, and together the two of them filled in more of the details for me. Debbie had once worked there and had her own stories. We talked about chairs turning backwards, customers seeing a ghostly couple eating at a booth only to look again and find them gone, and a woman's presence lingering in the cellar, where many believed she was unhappy about the remodeling. We talked about menus being snatched from customers' hands, chairs mysteriously lifted onto tables, forks pulled away, and even an overwhelming perfume smell that seemed to move from room to room before vanishing completely. The mafia room came up again and again. Workers said chairs moved there often. One waiter reportedly left the room and came back to find chairs on top of the table. One waitress felt a hand on her shoulder and turned to find no one there. Brian told me that when they clean up and place chairs on tables, they sometimes come back later to find the chairs neatly back on the floor. Debbie told me that one wine glass had even broken in half and the bottom piece flew into a customer's lap. She also said she hated the linen room and would not even enter it anymore. When I stepped into that room myself, I felt a heaviness there that was hard to ignore. After the interview, Debbie and I decided to eat. The food was excellent. She had cheese pasta with salad and tea. I had chicken parmesan with beef vegetable soup and a Coke. I still remember how good that meal was. Sometimes it feels funny eating something delicious while discussing hauntings, death, and moving chairs, but that is part of the strange balance of this work. Life and the supernatural are always pressed together. After Fulton's, Debbie told me she had a surprise for me. She led me to a residential haunting we called the Hess home. The family there had bought the house in 1987, and the paranormal activity had started in 1990. Occupant number 1, her children, and her mother all had stories to tell. In the kitchen, a stove knob had once popped off on its own and flown 10 feet. The coffee machine had turned itself on and off 3 separate times. The faucet once dripped 3 times, stopped, repeated that process 3 more times, and then stopped altogether only after the occupant ordered it to stop. In the living room, the occupant's brother had died in the house. Before he died, he had a habit of knocking 3 times on the wall when he needed help. The night after he died, the family heard those same 3 knocks again. Occupant number 1 once felt a gentle touch on her arm while standing in the room, and their cat Lynx often acted wildly there, as if reacting to something invisible. The backyard was large and beautiful, complete with a pool and jacuzzi. One day a photograph of the occupant's son showed him surrounded by a strange white mist near the storage area where her brother used to keep his belongings. Their dog Jigs was buried there too, and the family sometimes felt Jigs still played with the cat Lynx. They had actually observed Lynx behaving as if he was playing with an unseen friend in the yard. In the hallway, Lynx would sometimes stare at the wall, and then go racing up and down in a frantic state. A strange purple ray had appeared in one digital photograph, and the occupant's children both swore they had seen shadow people near the hallway bathroom. Occupant number 1 believed there were 2 entities in the house, one of which might be her brother. In what used to be the brother's room, now her son's room, the TV and fan would switch on by themselves. It also felt like the hottest room in the house, and when I walked in, The whole atmosphere seemed gloomy. In occupant number one's bedroom, strange things had also happened. One night the doorknob would not turn at all, and the door would not open despite all her effort. Suddenly, after a long struggle, it just opened. The television there had switched itself on too. One night there was an odd scratching noise in the room that caused Lynx to lose his mind. Then, mysteriously, it stopped. On another occasion, a green dot appeared on the wall. It had no obvious light source. When she put her hand over the dot, it did not appear on her hand. By the next day, it was simply gone. The walls also showed odd discoloration that no one could explain. Her mother's room had its own disturbances. She often heard knocking on the shower door. Then, one day, a loud crash came from that room, and when everyone ran in, both shower doors were shattered for no clear reason. Occupant number one also happened to be part of Wiccan culture, with a gazing ball in the backyard, steps that said magical, and even a Harry Potter-themed license plate and frame referencing platform 9 3/4. It was an interesting detail, not because it explained anything, but because it gave the house a very personal flavor. While at the Hess home, I did some of my own work. In the brothers' room, I sat quietly with my listen-up sound enhancer and asked, "Is there anyone here?" After repeating the question several times, I finally heard a male voice whisper, "Yes." I followed up by asking if there was anything he wanted to say. After several tries, the answer I got was, "Why?" We also took digital photos and caught hollow circle orbs in a sequence of images, something different from the usual round ball-like orbs I often photograph. While talking with the family, we also heard some strange small knocks coming from the garage area. After I dropped Debbie off and headed home, I got another call from my neighbor Nick Acevedo. Nick believes that ghosts from a haunted house in Reno followed his family all the way to Elk Grove. He told me about a blender turning on and off, a photo with an orb behind his son, and a television that changes channels by itself, something his girlfriend had also witnessed. The funny part was that his house is right across the street from mine. I told him I would do a preliminary investigation next week. Then I hung up, and the thought came into my mind that always seems to return in this work. It never ends. And it really did not end that night. As I sat down to write about all of this, the phone rang again. This time it was a woman from Compton. I will call her Rotunda. She was crying and sounded completely terrified. She said an entity in her home was scratching her daughter. She did not want to get off the phone with me. As we spoke, I heard an ungodly deep male voice on the line about 6 different times. She kept asking if I was the one making that noise. I told her no, I was not. That only made her more frightened. I tried to calm her. I suggested that she have her church bless the house. We said prayers together over the phone. While still talking to her, I searched online for paranormal groups in Los Angeles and emailed 4 of them, letting them know this woman needed immediate help. I also gave her Janet Milchak's phone number so she could speak to a psychic and spiritual counselor who might help calm her down through the crisis. I informed Shannon McCabe right away and knew she would follow up too. While we were on the phone, the woman said she saw 3 shadows moving toward her. She was panicked. She told me there was a power pole directly in front of her house, and in my experience homes with severe activity often sit near power poles, as if entities can somehow feed off that electrical energy and grow stronger enough to move things or touch people. I urged her to leave for the night and stay with a friend. She said she would. She thanked me over and over for staying on the line with her. As I listened to her cry and beg for help, hearing that strange deep male voice on the line and hearing the fear in her voice as she described the shadows, chills ran up and down my spine. I usually do not scare easily. This work has taken me into old cemeteries, haunted restaurants, abandoned stories, and witness accounts that would make most people avoid sleep for a week. But this was different. The fear in her voice, the idea of her daughter being scratched by something unseen, the helplessness of hearing it through a phone line while she begged for help, that shook me more than I expected. And that is what my cell phone life really is. It is prank calls from cousins pretending to be members of secret organizations. It is HPI investigators calling about Black Dahlia graves, Bigfoot sightings, haunted cottages, and restaurant phantoms. It is costume parties where ghost hunters dance to Thriller. It is dinner in haunted basements. It is orbs, knocks, perfume that moves from room to room, and menus flying off tables. It is neighbors saying ghosts followed them from Reno. It is someone claiming to be a zombie. And then, when the night is almost over and you think maybe the strangest thing left will be a joke or a story, it is a terrified mother on the other end of the line, listening to an impossible voice in her own home while shadows move toward her and her child. That is why sometimes I say a ghost hunter or ghostwriter needs a break. But even when I get that break, the phone still rings. And every time it rings, I know it could be something ridiculous, something tragic, something exciting, something heartbreaking, or something that will leave me with goosebumps all the way up my arms. In this world, you never really know which call will come next. And that is exactly why, no matter how strange it gets, I keep answering. Sorry to interrupt. If you're enjoying the story, let me know in the comments and tell me where you're watching from. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more. When I was 3 years old, my parents bought their first house. I am 37 now, with a home and family of my own, but that house is still one of the most unforgettable places in my life. Even after all these years, whenever I think about it, I do not just remember the rooms or the yard or the way it looked from the street. I remember the feeling of it. I remember the way certain parts of the house never felt fully empty, even when there was no one there. I remember how normal life carried on inside those walls while strange things happened around us often enough that, after a while, the impossible started to feel almost familiar. It was not the kind of haunting that exploded all at once in one terrible night and changed everything immediately. It was slower than that. It lived with us. It moved through the years with us. It became part of the house's history and, in a strange way, part of our family's story too. The first experience I can personally remember clearly happened when I was 5 years old, around the time my younger brother was born. We shared a bedroom then. I was still very young, of course, so my own memories from that time come in pieces. But this particular event stayed with all of us because of what my mother saw. One night, in the middle of the night, my mother came into our room to check on my baby brother. That was a normal thing for her to do. Mothers with new babies wake up often, walk softly through dark rooms, check blankets, listen for breathing, and make sure everything is all right. She expected a quiet room, 2 sleeping children, and nothing more. But when she stepped in and looked toward the crib, she saw an elderly woman standing next to it. Not just a shadow. Not just a shape. A woman. That moment marked the real beginning of everything for our family, even if at the time none of us knew how long it would continue. My mother was deeply shaken by what she saw, but she also knew what she saw. It was not one of those moments where she half thought she had imagined it, and then laughed it off in the morning. The figure was clear enough, present enough, that she understood right away that something was not normal in that room. And yet, from what I was told later, there was also something strangely calm about the sighting. The woman was not lunging at the crib. She was not doing anything violent or wild. She was just there, standing next to my brother, as though watching over him or checking on him. That does not mean it was not frightening. Of course it was. But there was a stillness to it that stayed with my mother afterward. That was not the only time we experienced her. In fact, after that, she became a regular part of the house in a way that is difficult to explain to people who have never lived with repeated paranormal activity. She was not something we talked about one time and then forgot. We saw her many times after that. Not every night, not in a way you could predict, but often enough that she became known in the house. We knew there had once been an elderly woman who had owned the home before my parents bought it. That was about the only real information we had, but it felt like enough to connect the figure we saw to the house's past. There was no full dramatic backstory then, no long history from neighbors, no tragic tale that explained everything. We simply knew an older woman had lived there before, and now an older woman kept appearing. At first, most of the sightings were connected to the bedroom I shared with my brother. That made sense, in a way, because the first sighting happened there beside his crib. It felt as if whatever attachment this woman had to the house, that room was one of the places where her presence came through most strongly. As a child, I did not have a full adult understanding of what it all meant. I only knew that there were moments when the room did not feel quite right, moments when adults would become tense, moments when things would go quiet in a way that felt heavier than ordinary silence. Children notice more than adults sometimes realize, even if they cannot explain it in the same words. Then, when I was about 8 years old, my parents had a large addition built onto the house. This was a major change for the family. The house grew, rooms were added, and the layout shifted. Renovations always bring their own noise, mess, and stress, and when they were finished, it felt in some ways like we were living in a new version of the old house. But one thing became very clear after the addition was complete. The activity did not spread into the new areas. That detail stayed with us because it was so specific. The sightings and strange experiences did not follow the fresh construction. They remained tied to the older part of the house. After the addition, the elderly woman was no longer seen only in the bedroom. People also began seeing her in the kitchen and dining room. Those rooms, like the bedroom, were part of the original house. The fact that she appeared there too seemed to confirm something all of us slowly started to understand. Whatever her connection was, it was tied to the original home, not to the new space my parents had built on. That made the whole thing feel even more real, because it suggested a kind of boundary. Spirits, if that is what we were dealing with, did not always move without pattern. She seemed attached to what had existed in her time, to the old structure, the old rooms, the old life of the house. As the years went on, we all got used to living with the possibility of seeing her. I do not mean we stopped caring or that it no longer frightened anyone. But there is a difference between the first shocking encounter with something unexplained and the slow, strange acceptance that comes when it happens more than once. You start noticing which rooms feel different. You learn which corners of the house seem to carry more weight. You become aware of the old parts of the home in a deeper way. A bedroom is no longer just a bedroom. A dining room is no longer just a dining room. Each place starts to hold memory in a way that goes beyond normal family life. Still, not everyone believed easily. That became especially clear years later, when I was in my early 20s. By then I was married, and my husband and I had a son. At some point, my husband and son came with me to visit my parents' home for a week. This was his first time really staying there. Up to that point, I had never told him about the sightings. I had lived with them for years, but I had kept that part of my past quiet. Maybe I did not want to sound crazy. Maybe I did not feel like trying to explain something that had become so complicated and layered in my own mind. Or maybe I thought that if I did not mention it, it would not matter. Either way, he came into that house without any warning about what we had experienced there. One day during our visit, everyone in the family except my husband left the house to go shopping. He stayed behind alone. And it is important to say that this happened in the middle of the day. Daylight matters in stories like this because people are often quicker to dismiss paranormal experiences that happen at night, when fear, darkness, and tiredness can blur the edges of things. But this was not one of those late-night moments. It was daytime. The house was quiet, and he was there by himself, just spending time indoors while the rest of us were out. When we came back, he was not inside. He was sitting outside on the porch. The second I saw him there, something in me shifted because I could tell from the look on his face that something had happened. He did not come out to enjoy the weather. He was waiting. He took me aside and brought me into the bedroom, where he finally told me what had gone on while we were away. He said he had been watching television in the older part of the home when the TV suddenly turned off by itself. At first he wrote it off. Electronics act up. Things happen. He turned it back on. Then it turned off again. That was enough to get his attention, but even then he was still looking for a practical reason. He got up to turn it on again, and just then he heard banging on the outer wall of the house next to where the TV was. Again, he tried to be rational. Maybe it was an animal. Maybe something had hit the wall outside. Maybe there was an explanation he just had not figured out yet. He turned the TV back on, and then things got worse. He told me he heard what sounded like several people walking in through the back door and into the kitchen. Not one person. Several. Then he heard cupboard doors opening and closing. The sounds were clear enough that he naturally assumed the family had gotten back early. He even shouted out something like, "You're all back already?" expecting an answer from us. But no one answered. And the moment he said it, everything went quiet. That kind of sudden silence is one of the most disturbing details in any haunting story. Noise, even strange noise, still gives the mind something to chase. But when sound stops all at once, it leaves you staring into an absence that feels even more unnatural. My husband said that by that point he had had enough. He went outside and stayed on the porch waiting for us to return. He was not willing to stay in the house alone any longer. That was when I finally sat him down and told him everything. I told him about the activity in the house. I told him about the elderly woman. I told him that my mother had seen her standing by my brother's crib. I told him about the years of sightings in the old rooms. I also told him that at some point, I was going to wake him up in the middle of the night and asked him to look in one particular corner of the bedroom without saying a word. I wanted to know whether he would see what the rest of us had seen. I did not say much more than that. I did not describe her in advance. I did not feed him details. I wanted him to witness whatever he witnessed on his own. A couple of nights later, the moment came. I woke him up in the middle of the night, quietly, and did exactly what I had warned him I would do. I told him to look in a certain corner of the bedroom and say nothing. He did. For a few moments he stared. Then, after a little while, she was gone. Once the moment had passed, I told him that I was going to describe exactly what he had just seen. I described a woman in her 70s. I described her as around 4'7". I described her wearing a dark nightgown. I described her dark gray hair pulled back into a loose bun. When I finished, his mouth fell open. He did not know what to say. I had just described perfectly the woman he had seen. That moment mattered deeply to me because it was not just another family story anymore. It was not only my mother and me in the years of living in that house. It was now my husband too, someone who had come into the home without any warning, someone I had not influenced with stories beforehand, someone who had his own separate experience in broad daylight, and then saw the same woman in the bedroom. That gave the whole thing another layer of reality. It took it out of the category of old family lore and into something much harder to dismiss. From then on, the experiences never fully stopped. Even to this day, there are still stories that come out of that house. Lamps turn on by themselves. People hear noises they cannot explain. The old parts of the home still seem to carry something with them. It is not always dramatic, and it is not always terrifying in the same sharp way as those earlier years, but the presence has never completely disappeared. The house still has a life to it beyond the life of the family that lives there. And because I grew up with that, because I watched it continue across decades, I think about it differently now than I would have if it had only been a few isolated incidents. What stands out to me most when I look back is the consistency of it all. The woman remained the same. Her appearance remained the same. Her activity stayed tied to the older part of the house. Even after the addition was built, she did not move into the new spaces. That kind of pattern is hard for me to ignore. If strange things had happened randomly here and there, maybe I could have chalked it up to imagination, nerves, house noises, or coincidence. But the fact that the same elderly woman kept appearing, with the same description, in the same section of the home, over so many years, makes it feel much more anchored than that. I often think about what she might have wanted, if anything. There are hauntings that seem openly threatening, and there are others that feel more like unfinished presents. With her, I never had the sense that she was trying to harm us. Startle us, yes. Frighten us, absolutely. But not harm us. My mother seeing her by the crib is actually one of the strangest examples of that. There is something frightening about finding an old woman standing over your baby in the dark. but there is also something almost watchful about it. It makes you wonder whether she was simply checking on him in the way she once might have checked on children in that room when it was her house. That does not make it less terrifying to witness, but it changes the emotional shape of the experience. The same can be said about the kitchen and dining room. Those are lived-in places full of routine and family life. She was seen there too, not in hidden corners of the basement or dark closets, but in rooms where people gather, eat, and move through daily habits. That gives the haunting a domestic feeling, like she never fully stopped being part of the house's ordinary life. It is unsettling, but also strangely intimate. She did not feel like a random spirit passing through. She felt like someone who still belonged there in her own mind. Even my husband's daytime experience had that same ordinary quality before it became frightening. A TV turning off. Sounds from the kitchen. Cupboard doors opening and closing. It all sounded like household life continuing. It was only frightening because there should have been no one there. That is a very different kind of fear from the kind that comes with chains rattling or doors slamming. It is the fear of hearing home continue by itself. Sometimes I wonder whether the old woman even knew we were different people from the ones she remembered. Maybe in some strange way she was only replaying her routines, stepping through old spaces that still felt like hers, appearing where the house still held her memory most strongly. Or maybe she saw us clearly and simply chose to remain. There is no way to know. But over the years, those questions have become part of how I think about hauntings in general. Not every spirit, if that is what they are, seems driven by rage or darkness. Some seem attached by habit, memory, or love of place. That does not make them easy to live with, but it does make them more complicated than the usual horror stories suggest. What also fascinates me is how haunting seems to move through generations in a family. My mother had her first clear sighting. I grew up with the house and its strange atmosphere. My husband came in as an outsider and saw the same woman. That means the experience did not depend on childhood imagination or long family storytelling alone. It crossed into the life of someone who had no prior reason to expect it. That matters to me. It means the house could introduce itself to new people the same way it had introduced itself to us. And the house itself was never just a spooky old shell. It was our family home. That is what always makes these stories more powerful to me. This was not some abandoned building people dared each other to enter. It was where my parents raised us. Where my brother slept in his crib. Where meals were made. Where people visited. Where we lived our ordinary lives. That is what makes the elderly woman's presence so unforgettable. She did not appear in some place already marked by fear. She appeared in the middle of family life. I think that is why people who grow up in haunted homes often speak about them differently from people who only visit haunted places. When you live in it, the haunting gets braided into normal memory. You cannot separate the spirit entirely from the smell of dinner, the sound of footsteps in the hall, or the shape of the house at different times of day. It becomes part of the emotional map of childhood. You remember the good things and the strange things all mixed together. That is exactly how that house lives in my mind. Even now, being far from that age in that house, I can still picture those old rooms more clearly than many places I have lived since. I can picture the original bedroom, the kitchen, the dining room. I can picture the way the house must have felt after the addition went on, when the old structure ended and the new space began. I can picture the porch where my husband sat waiting, unwilling to stay inside alone after what he heard. And I can picture his face when I described the woman exactly as he had seen her. That face is one of the strongest parts of the story for me. Because that was the moment where private memory became shared proof in a way I could not ignore. He had not heard the description first. He had not been looking for her. He had not been primed by years of family stories. Yet there she was, and there she remained, the same as ever. A small elderly woman, dark nightgown, gray hair and a loose bun, appearing in the old corner of the old house as if time had never fully moved her out of it. The fact that things still happen there now only adds to that feeling. Lamps turning on by themselves. Strange noises. Little signs that the house is not entirely done telling its story. Some people might find that frightening enough that they would refuse to enter or stay there. And maybe if I had not grown up with it, I would feel that way too. But because the haunting developed slowly over years, I see it through a more layered lens. It scared us, yes. It still can. But it also became part of what made that house what it was. Not in a romantic way, and not in a way I would ever recommend to someone else, but in a truthful way. The house had history, and some of that history never fully left. I also sometimes think about the previous owner, the elderly woman we knew had lived there before. We never had a full story. We only knew enough to connect her identity loosely to the house. But I wish sometimes that we had learned more. Was she happy there? Did she lose someone there? Did she die there or only move on from there before dying elsewhere? Did she spend years in those kitchen and dining room routines that still seem to echo through the house? The fact that we only had pieces makes the haunting feel even more mysterious, because it leaves us with just enough information to believe and never enough to explain. That is perhaps the most honest thing I can say about all of it. We experienced something real, at least real enough to be seen and heard by multiple people over many years, but we never fully understood it. The house gave us a presence, not an answer. It gave us a pattern, not an explanation.
It let us see an old woman and hear signs of continued activity, but it never told us why she remained or what exactly she wanted. Maybe some hauntings are like that. Maybe they are not stories meant to resolve neatly. Maybe they simply continue until they do not. Or maybe they continue long after people stop trying to understand them. In our case, the story is still not entirely over. The house still produces those occasional strange moments, those little reminders that whatever stayed there has not completely moved on. And because of that, I do not think of the haunting as something that belonged only to my childhood. It belongs to the house itself, and the house still stands. As long as it does, I suppose some part of her may remain there too. When people ask whether I believe in ghosts, I do not answer the way I might have if I had only heard stories from other people. I answer from a life lived around one. I answer from years of seeing how one small elderly woman, tied somehow to an old home, could remain part of a family's experience across time. I answer from the knowledge that my mother saw her by my brother's crib, that I grew up with her in the house, that my husband met her years later without knowing she existed, and that strange things still happen there even now. That is not something I can brush aside. It is not something I can explain away. And it is certainly not something I can forget. So when I think back on that house, I do not think only of my parents buying their first home when I was 3. I think of a home that carried 2 families in a way, the living one and the one that came before. I think of a woman who never fully left. I think of years of sightings in old rooms, of daytime sounds no one could explain, of a porch, a bedroom corner, a dark nightgown, and a loose gray bun. I think of the way the original part of the house held on to her, while the new addition remained untouched by her presence. And I think of how some homes do not simply shelter the people living in them now. Sometimes they also shelter the echoes of those who loved them long before.